Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of Bristol and this third Coleridge lecture. These lectures are in partnership with Bristol 2015 and the Cabot Institute. And we would like to thank Arts Council England, Bristol City Council, University of West of England, and Business West for their support. And I hope you'll see our website and the brochures for more details of further lectures in this series. And I've been asked also to mention that there's an opportunity to take a self-guided tour of Bristol and Bristol's connection with the Romantic poets. Well, my name's James Ladyman. I'm Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol, and until recently I was the head of department. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Roger Scruton to you tonight. Professor Scruton has had a distinguished career as a philosopher, both as an academic philosopher and also as a public intellectual and contributor to public and social and political debate and public life. His academic career has concentrated on aesthetics, especially music and architecture, and he's on the board of the British Journal for Aesthetics and is one of the world's leading aestheticians. Professor Scruton is known as a conservative thinker with a small c and perhaps a large c as well. But certainly with a small c, I think, is the emphasis that he'll be putting on tonight. And he's been a courageous commentator in that he stood against orthodoxy and prevailing wisdom of his milieu. So many of us on the broad liberal left of society, and those sort of people are prominent in academia, have been challenged by Professor Scruton's views. And in a university, I think it's extremely important that we pay close attention and listen to the views and arguments of people we disagree with. Now, many of us may also agree with what he has to say. I don't know. I'm going to be very excited to find out what that will be. He'll be talking about his latest book. He's written a great many books, and his latest one is called Green Philosophy, How to Think Seriously About the Planet. Well, thank you very much for coming, and without further ado, Professor Scruton.
Thank you very much, Professor Ladyman, for introducing me, and thank you to the organisers of the Festival of Ideas for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be talking in a series dedicated to the memory of the great poet Coleridge, who's not only a great poet but also one of the founding fathers of intellectual conservatism in this country, which I guess is makes a connection with me, although I don't have, of course, his great talent. I've called this talk "Love Thy Neighbourhood," because my emphasis is really on the kind of affection for things around us, which I think is the root of conservative thinking, and also the emotion on which we draw, and which is aroused in us by our sense of belonging to an environment greater than ourselves, and our attempts to rescue the environment, in my view, in the end, all depend upon this sentiment. But of course we need to start in thinking about environmental questions from some conception of what the problem is. Why is it that everybody is so alarmed by this problem, and what kind of a problem is it? If we look at it impartially and philosophically, I think you could recognize that it's a problem that has a particular logical form. Rational egoists, that's to say people like you and me, externalize their costs. That's to say, if they can get away with it, they pass their costs on to other people while retaining their benefits. This is something that we all do all the time. But in the course of doing this, we may, and these rational egoists, may defeat their long-term aims. And this is a matter that has been discussed at great length in the literature of practical reason and social logic, and various paradoxes have emerged, which people have meditated over in many different disciplines. But the particular one that has interested environmentalists is the paradox which is sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, which has the following form, that we share an asset in common with other people around us. For instance, a lake. We are all settled around a lake, and we feed ourselves from the fish in the lake. And this is a common asset. Nobody has any particular private property in it, but we all have the right to fish. Of course, I, worrying about who is next going to take the fish from the lake, and knowing that it might not be me, I take as much as I can while I can, because on the assumption that if I don't take it, someone else will. And this is what a rational egoist will do. In other words, if something is held in common, rational egoists strive to get the maximum share of it before others do likewise. And the result, of course, is that the commons are very rapidly depleted. This is something that has been observed widely in our world throughout history, and it is being observed now in the case of the oceans. We all know that the oceans are being depleted by factory fishing boats which scoop up as much as they can without regard for the sustainability of what they're doing. And there are various other paradoxes of social choice which operate in this area. Another and similar problem is that of uglification. The world, uglification is a word which we owe to Lewis Carroll, of course, through the Looking Glass. It's one of the things that you were taught in Alice's school. But the word has been picked up by Kundera, the Czech writer, and used to describe a feature of our world which he thinks is more and more apparent, and which is alienating us from the world. That by discarding our waste everywhere, by leaving behind us a trail of the things that we don't want, we uglify our environment so that others are alienated from it too. And this is a kind of way of externalizing our costs, which also has a long-term impact on ourselves. So in these ways, we seem to be degrading our environment through obeying our rational disposition to secure our interests whenever we can. But in these cases, damage to my neighbour is obviously going to be a damage to myself, not perhaps immediately, but in the long term. And the question then is, how do we rectify that damage? And that is preceded by another question, namely, who is my neighbour? The famous question that was put to Christ, and which elicited from him the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think here we have to recognise that we are not just first-person rational choosers, that we don't actually only think in terms of I, what I want and what will be best to secure my desires. We also think in terms of we. All of us have a sense of the first-person plural, which is perhaps an adaptable sense. It's not we associate ourselves with different first-person plurals depending upon the context. But nevertheless, all of us in the end depend upon some sense of community when we set about addressing these great problems, such as that of the tragedy of the commons. So we identify ourselves spontaneously as part of a community. This community might itself be included in a larger one, and there may be other communities which stand, as it were, in relation to the one that I belong, but to which I do not belong. Now, I think that it's very important to recognise that this first-person plural is a necessary input into practical reasoning. And this is especially so when we're dealing with these problems like the problems of the environment, where we are not asking the question, what should I do? But we're asking the question, what should we do? And we need to know who this we is. And this is where I take this is what I take to be the starting point of a sensible environmental philosophy. The crucial person here in starting off this thought is Edmund Burke, who recognised that there couldn't be, in his view, anything like a political order which didn't identify a first-person plural. I want to read to you something that I wrote in this book, Green Philosophy, which Professor Ladyman just kindly referred to, because I think it encapsulates what I think is the real issue. So Burke took the view that society is an association of the dead, the living, and the unborn. And this carries a precious hint as to how the responsibility for future generations arises. It arises, on Burke's view at least, from love. And love directed towards what is unknown must arise from what is known. The future is not known, nor are the people who will inhabit it. But the past is known, and the dead, our dead, are still the objects of love and veneration. It is by expending on them some part of our care, Burke believed, that we care also for the unborn, for we plant in our hearts the transgenerational view of society that is the best guarantee that we will moderate our present appetites in the interests of those who are yet to be. Now that is a summary of a particular view of what a social order is, but I think it's an indispensable view that we have to recognise, not just that we are bound in a first-person plural to others who exist along with us, but also that included in that first-person plural are people who are both dead and unborn, people who are not present among us, but whose interests, nevertheless, have to be respected. I think that this is manifest most obviously in the love that we all have towards our home. Home is a difficult idea because, of course, it's something that, although we're born into it, it's also something that we have a natural instinct to leave. We all need to leave home at some stage and wander away from it, but we only do so in order to acquire another desire, which is the desire to come back, to return in some way and know the place for the first time. And it might be a home that we ourselves have made, but until we have that homing instinct, we don't really know what it is that binds us to the world around us. And I call this general homing instinct oikophilia. That's from the Greek oikos, the homecoming, or the home rather, and philia, the love thereof. And I use that word because it always brings to mind the foundational work of European literature, namely Homer's Odyssey, which tells a wonderful story of a man who leaves the island where he is with shacked up with a goddess who's promised him immortality and every possible benefit. He leaves it to sail across dangerous seas to reach his home and his mortal wife, because that home is his. And the story of the Odyssey is the story of his journey back to the place where he belongs, renouncing immortality and life with a goddess in order to do so. And so it's a wonderful story about the sense of place and how it rules ultimately in our emotions, even when we reject it or even when we have wandered far away from it. So this sense of place is a sense of a place as ours, and it brings with it the idea of a settled community. We want to belong to a settled community, but of course we spend much of our lives unsettled, looking for that community. And it's unsettlement which ultimately causes most of the environmental catastrophes that we've seen. Here is one environmental catastrophe which is normally put forward as a solution, however, to the great problem of renewable energy. And as a result of this, the enthusiasm for this kind of thing, which is heavily subsidized by the government, our landscape is being gradually sacrificed, or rapidly sacrificed, and of course in Scotland in a most distressing way. In Denmark and Germany, it's almost irremediable. What's wrong with that solution, in my view, is first of all that it's unadaptable. It changes the environment in a way which is not going to be easy to reverse. In 20 years' time, when a real solution has been found to the renewable energy, those windmills, wind turbines will stand broken and derelict all over the countryside, and nobody will know how to get rid of them. So it produces irreversible damage, and it's unreal as a solution. So we can see from the German case, the Germans have done as much as they can to make their energy supply dependent only on solar power and wind power. But as we know, it still produces only 20% of what they need, and when there's a large demand, or when there is too much wind or whatever, they have in any case to supply the lack from other sources. They've forbidden themselves the use of nuclear power because the German Greens have lobbied so powerfully against it, so they plug in to the French grid to get their electricity, which is run off nuclear power. The whole thing is riddled with these practical paradoxes because the thing hasn't been thought through. And when you take on huge projects like this, there's an inevitable takeover by the state. Already in Britain, our wind farms are heavily subsidised by the state, and there's a state interest in maintaining them in being and in putting them forward as a solution so that politicians can say, well, look, we're doing something. But why would one object to it, however? I think I object to it because it is an offence to the only motive that really counts, which is our sense that some things can't be touched because they are our inheritance. It's an offence to the first-person plural that I just referred to. It's an unsettling thing, as we all know, because as soon as a wind farm is proposed, all local people agitate and lobby against it. All of them recognise that this will be the end of their little experience of home. And losing that sense of home, they lose the motive to protect their home. So the real motive that makes people protect their environment suffers from this kind of solution. And it postpones the real solution to the renewable energy problem, which is a scientific one, the discovery of some source of energy which really is sufficient for the number of people on the planet and the kind of life that they expect, and which does not warm the planet or does not produce the kind of gases that will lead to the warming of the planet. But that's something which can only be achieved by a heavy investment in research. And if the government has a role to play, it must be that must be its role. But again, I think also the appeal does lie partly in the damage. Many people who agitate for wind farms feel a certain pride in the way in which these projects break the grip of nostalgia. They are projects directed against the NIMBYs, who are the principal representative in modern life of the class that needs to be dispossessed. So, so there's a lot of, I think, of animus behind the building of these wind farms too. And one should contrast this with the Victorian railways. Here is the Brecon Beacons railway viaduct. The introduction of the railways in the 19th century produced the same kind of fear and agitation on behalf of the environment as we're seeing today, although it's a very different kind, directed towards different things, led, of course, by Coleridge's lifelong friend William Wordsworth, who campaigned against the introduction of the railways to the Lake District. But when the railways were finally built, and these great viaducts and engineering works were undertaken, they were undertaken in a spirit of if you like, sanctification, that, an addition to the landscape, which would show it to be the noble thing that all the poets have said it was. And most of the Victorian railway additions were built in the styles recommended by people like Ruskin, who opposed the building of them in the first place. So I think we should move on from this question of renewable energy, because we don't have a solution to it. And the things like the wind farms are unreal solutions which leave us with another pollution of their own. I think we should address the real problems about which we can do something, and the one that most concerns me is plastic. This is a huge problem. It's as global as the problem of energy, of course, but it has local solutions. It's a paradigm case of what economists call market failure due to externalities. Plastic enables people to externalize their costs in a massive way. The cost of distributing food across, cheaply across a whole continent and so on. The cost of carrying around with you your packed lunch, all the little things that you need to get through a railway journey, which you can do very simply by buying it all packaged in plastic and throwing the rest out of the window. So, and it results largely from hidden subsidies offered to centralised industries and of health and safety regulations. You know, in the supermarket today, something like 20% of the weight of the products that go out of the door is plastic. It's the wrappings around the food, or the bottles in which things are bottled, and so on, and those plastic trays which protect vegetables from being squashed when they're all piled up in their boxes for easy transport. Now, you might say that that's, of course, something without which there wouldn't be the kind of easygoing nationwide distribution of products that we enjoy. We can enjoy products from all over the world, but as the environmentalists have told us, we only enjoy these because the transport of them has been heavily subsidized by, first of all, by the building of roads, secondly, by the lifting of planning restrictions so that people can store them in great warehouses, refrigerated warehouses on the outskirts of towns, and so on. These hidden subsidies offered to these centralised industries also give them a competitive advantage over the local food economy and over the little shops that previously distributed food to people. So inevitably, the supermarkets win out, and the regime of plastic wrapping takes a step forward. But one must not ignore also the effect of health and safety regulations. Supermarkets campaign on behalf of health and safety regulations, which require us, for instance, to wrap things wrap meat in plastic so it's not exposed to the air and so on, because that is the easiest and simplest way of driving their competitors to the wall. The small local farmers market can't do this. It can't wrap its stuff in such a way as to satisfy requirements of health and safety, whereas a supermarket easily can through centralised distribution networks. Now, here is an example of something where we have imposed upon ourselves something which is actually not necessary, the wrapping of food in plastic, by permitting these hidden subsidies and by imposing unnecessary health and safety regulations which add to the problem. So the solution is to hand, which is to get rid of those regulations and also to get rid of the hidden subsidies, or at least make the subsidies available to everyone. But it needs regulations that penalise externalities and reward internal solutions. People should be penalised for wrapping things in plastic rather than encouraged to do so. There should be a way in which this cost is returned to the person who actually produces it. The result of plastic pollution is well known. This is a little bit of the Pacific whirlpool the great, this great mass of plastic. Some say it's twice the size of Texas, swirling around in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It only needs 0.001% of our plastic wrappings to be carried away by the wind and to eventually wash down to the ocean for this to become the kind of problem that it is. So that, there is the problem, and here is the solution. And both of them are absolutely apparent to us. Both of them can be worked towards on the local level. And at the local level, success will breed success. A government which forbade the export of things in non-biodegradable wrappings would very quickly change the international market in such things too. Now, when you offer these sort of solutions, I know a lot of detail is absent from what I've just said, but when one begins to think in this way, you always come up against the forward-looking people who say, we can't go back. Now, the correct response to someone who says we can't go back is to say, I know, but I'm calling it forward. Because it's only a word, go forward to the past if you don't like going back to it. But the main point about this is that there is an unexplored motive in people, the motive which I call oikophilia, which can be elicited, it can be encouraged, and once it comes to the fore, it does tend to mobilize people in the direction that we want them to go. It's a motive which encourages them to put the I concept to one side and adopt the we concept instead. And it has many forms. Oikophilia is manifest in our love of beauty. This is where it first entered English literature in a way. I mean, the great invocations of natural beauty in Wordsworth and Coleridge are really also invocations of a shared sense of home, the sense of being in a place and loving it and knowing that one's identity is mingled with it. So, and that love of beauty is something which entered our literature in the late 18th century, became the ruling idea throughout the 19th century, and in particular in the work of John Ruskin, who built from this concept of beauty his conception of exactly how human beings should live in the world, how they should respect that world and see it always as something greater than themselves. And it's to Ruskin, in fact, that we owe the environmental movement as we have inherited it. It's he who wrote the first great theoretical utterances, such as the Seven Lamps of Architecture, in which he made clear that if without the sense of beauty, we will leave the earth desolate as we pass through it. And it was a disciple of Ruskin's who set up the National Trust at the end of the 19th century. But oikophilia also manifests itself in the love of children, the love of parents, the sense that we have duties that are located in a place. And these all point us beyond the empirical world, beyond our immediate sentiments, towards another form of order. We're always trying to make an order greater than that of our own appetites, to see things as though they had some kind of eternal validity. And that is something which answers to our moral sense too, our sense of responsibility towards things which reaches out well beyond our own immediate desires and needs, and which is connected with that emotion which is called agape in the New Testament, the love of one's neighbour, the love to which we the love to which we are commanded, as Kant puts it. And this love of neighbour is, I think, the same ultimate emotion as the love of neighbourhood. We are all, of course, disposed to be disordered in our behaviour. Entropy is always increasing, as the physicists tell us. But we are also, unlike the other animals, we have a tendency in the other direction, the tendency towards settlement, of containing this entropy, of of gathering energy from our surroundings so as to maintain order of a more permanent kind. That brings me to, I've mentioned the energy problem and the need, the great problem about how we find safe and renewable sources of energy. I've mentioned plastic, which seems to me to be a soluble problem, which everybody is ignoring, although everybody can see it all around us. And I want to conclude with another problem, which is that of urbanism. Because if what I've said is right, we human beings have a need for settlement in order to fulfill our sense of oikophilia, a sense that there's a place that is ours, a place to which we can devote our more communal feelings, a place which is connected with our first-person plural. But we live in a world in which urbanism seems to also have gone radically wrong, is producing a trail of waste and as people externalize their costs into their environment. So we're living in the world of sprawl and what some Americans call edge city, where a city is constantly moving outwards and all the life is on the edges, where people still try to enjoy a little view of the countryside with a supermarket near enough for them to drive to, and meanwhile the city in the middle dies. What is the solution to this problem? Many people in America say it isn't a problem, let it go on forever, but which is something you can just about, and that's an idea you can just about entertain in a large continent which is still not overcrowded, but of course you can't entertain that view here in this, which is the most overcrowded country in Europe, which is in turn the most overcrowded continent in the world. So the solution to this, in my view, is aesthetic and not economic. We need aesthetic constraints which as it were, focus our attention inward onto the city and not outward. And in the past, this has always been understood, so that properly planned cities have had constraints, boundaries, constraints on height, for instance, as in Washington and Helsinki, constraints on boundaries, which has been our principal way of managing this in Britain, thanks to the Town and Country Planning Act of 1946, which set green belts around the major towns and forbade development beyond those green belts unless it was part of some radical departure, like building a new town and so on. Or there are constraints on materials, which is perhaps in many ways the most successful, as in Paris, or constraints imposed by neighbours, as in Switzerland, where in some cantons you can only build if you first of all put a little maquette in wood and cardboard up so that the neighbours can see whether they're going to like it, and then they can vote on it. Well, of course, that's now disappearing. But here is the result of the normal procedure of externalizing costs. And this is Newark, New Jersey, which is hell on earth, as anybody would know who's been there. You all have to pass through it if you take a cheap flight to America. But, luckily nobody ever goes out of the airport. But if the residents of Newark don't live in that mess, of course. They don't live there, they live here. But still, is that the kind of future that we want? And what is the environmental impact of that? The traditional settlement, of course, was a kind of settling down, which was also a reaching up. This is the classical Italian hilltop village in which people nestle side by side, and of course the whole thing is aesthetically beautiful and has a sense of comfort and homeliness which keeps people attached to it, at least until, of course, the local economy collapses. So the great question is, in order to consider this issue, is to ask ourselves, what are cities? In the past, they've been places of refuge. The city was not necessarily the place where you lived, it was the place to which you fled when the nomads invaded your your land. That was the place where you barricaded yourself in. It's a safe place behind the wall. But they were also places of settlement in due course, and they became so partly because they were sacred. If the Old Testament tells the story again and again of the holy city of Jerusalem, which is sacred because it's the place where the temple has been built to the God of the tribes, and that temple was built according to a design that he himself gave to Moses. This idea that you sanctify a place by building a temple seems to be have been universally accepted in the ancient world, and it's part of what made it possible for people to settle. If God has settled here, then that's obviously a good place for me to settle too. And in due course, these cities became places of law and civility. They would all be under the sovereignty of some individual sovereign or a council or whatever, which had a law-making capacity. So they are places where people obeyed the laws, obeyed the rules, and they obeyed them willingly. So they were places of order. And all that is contained in the aesthetic of the city, which is an aesthetic of fit. It's not about showing off or anything, except insofar as what is shown is an object of collective pride. It's about people fitting their lives together in a state of shared acquiescence in the customs and laws that bind the community. And that is what we see in the ideal city architecture. Here is obviously a very famous example of Nördlingen in Germany, where we see what the traditional city really was, the settling side by side of people within the walls, which you see it again, of course, in Carcassonne. And this goes back, as I say, to the ancient world, where the first gesture in settling was to build a temple to the god of the city, in this case Athena, who was also the lawgiver, whose presence in the city is celebrated in Athenian literature as well. And we see the same thing in Venice. And the reason why people visit Venice and long to be there, and so many people spent their holidays there, is of course that this sense of a settlement is written all over the buildings and all over the forms in which the architects used, the forms which enable you to see people settling side by side. And even a secular city, when there is no reference to a god, this is Washington, still consecrates itself to itself. All those buildings are secular, and yet they have that sense of the place being a sacred place too. So settlement involves such things as making a place for the gods, a place for law and sovereignty, a place for markets, building streets and squares, and all these features are embodied in the aesthetic judgments that we make. That's what makes things look right to us. And the abuse of the city is when we wipe away this sense of settlement. We'd either lose a dominant aesthetic, or we just let things crumble. And in the course of doing so, we desecrate the land on which the city is built. And this is something which happened deliberately in post-war Britain and America. This is in fact America, in which perfectly acceptable streets where people had settled side by side were swept away and replaced by things like that block in the background, where people live unhappily on top of each other. What resulted from that was the centrifugal city. Thanks to zoning and throughways, the city just burst out. Nobody wanted to live in the centre anymore. And in America, the zoning laws say that you must build here for industrial use, here you can have a school, here you can have shopping, here you can have residences, here there's factories and so on. Zoning, in other words, disaggregated the city And as a result, people could no longer walk to their work. They could no longer service their lives through their own energies. And as a result, the city fell apart. And this is an argument that was given by Jane Jacobs in a famous book, The Death and Life of American Cities. Of course, there was also the trapped population, the population in the centre, surrounded by throughways which they could never cross. And that was the most extraordinary result which people saw in the large American cities like Denver and so on, where you have a population which has never been able to leave the centre because it's too frightening to do so. I mean, you can't walk on the roads and so on. So the centre tends to die and the street disappears. And there's a huge ecological cost to this. The cost, in effect, of people fleeing to the edge of the city and gradually eating up the land, and so that there is eventually none of the land is left, and other species are driven out further into the wilderness. So this is another example of the paradoxes of social choice, in which the individual demand for what is wanted aggregates to a condition that nobody wants. And here is an example of downtown Detroit. This is a discarded city. Nobody could ever replace it, however. The cost of demolishing all that is beyond anything that a city council could undertake. So what are you going to do about it? The only thing to do is to move somewhere else and make the same mess of that. In Baltimore, the city died for a different reason, because there was no work available. And here is a really quite a beautiful street. If you imagine this in Chelsea, each house would be worth £2 million. But you can get those for $10 a time. Here's one where somebody refused to move. So in place of that centrifugal city, obviously one ought to aim at a centripetal city, one that is constantly moving towards the centre, not away from it. And a centripetal city will be a city with many goals. It won't be planned according to a particular goal for a particular purpose. All that is needed to make it centripetal is side constraints, rules which tell people where they can't go, what they can't do, like our green belt idea. Leave people to build as they want, perhaps, but not in this area, and make sure that they use certain materials, as in Paris, or that they respect the street, that they create public spaces, and that they make durable buildings. And a durable building is one that has a transferable use. If you could look back again to Detroit, all of those buildings were built for specific purposes. The purposes died, and the buildings with them. But if you look at, for instance, at this tower, when people discover, as they will in due course, that universities are quite useless, still this tower will exist, and so people will find another use for it. And you'll find that of all buildings which are built according to aesthetic criteria, that they have transferable uses. This is something that Leon Krier has argued at length. I won't go into that, but here is an example of a simple little town of buildings which have transferable uses and which have survived. So that it tells us why aesthetic judgment matters, why it is part of oikophilia. It's thanks to our aesthetic judgments that we actually want to conserve things. This tower will be conserved because people appreciate its beauty. And our countryside in Britain has been conserved for the same reason. The National Trust, which has 4 million members, is not a state organisation. It's the largest civic society that we have. And it consists of people who love the beauty of things and want to conserve them for that reason. And it's this love of beauty has been perhaps the most important conservational force in our particular society here. Without aesthetic judgment, the world becomes instrumentalized. We treat it purely as a functional thing. Everything is built as a means to an end, and that is manifest in so much modern architecture, that it's conceived in purely instrumental terms, a means to an end, and then of course the end disappears because the firm goes bankrupt or whatever, or the economy moves on, and the means becomes derelict. And that's what creates the edge city as people then abandon that wasteland and move further out. And so for things to be valued for a building to be valued as an end, for a street to be valued for its own sake, not as a means, and so on, it must be adaptable. And the cost of uglification is not just that things become ugly, but that people flee from those things. Ugly things don't retain people. Like the centre of Detroit, they are left. And that, I think this is one of the things that we are beginning to see in Europe too. The uglification of the suburbs of Paris has left a huge mark on the community, on French society in general. Nobody wants to stay in those places, and nobody can get out of them either. So a huge social resentment is built up. Right, so there's a fleeing from the neighbour, and the city itself is drained of agape, drained of this neighbour love. Here's the kind of thing that creates that. This is a wonderful example of modern architecture, not just defying the street, but destroying it. Even to clean the windows, you have to close the street, as you see. But we have our own examples here. This is Reading. Around Reading Station, you'll see the old centre of Reading, or the centre of Reading, as it was rebuilt during the 60s. You won't find any people there, but this is what you will find. All those buildings are derelict, and nobody can tear them down, not only because the cost is so huge, but because it would be dangerous to do so. So there it is, Reading, a dead city forever. So the real question is, what should we do in the place of this? And my view is that we should change our conception of what architecture is and what the city is. It shouldn't be a place where you build things to stand out or to answer to a particular function. It should be a place which is composed, where things fit together, where a place of negotiated solutions, where there are corners and cornices and so on. In this way, we would restore agape. This is the kind of thing that I have in mind. This is just ordinary Washington, Georgetown, of course, but it's still a place where you see buildings built according to that idea. Buildings which have a transferable function, which fit together. You made out of parts which you could, at the time, in the turn of the 19th and 20th century, you could buy from the local builder's merchant. The cornices are made out of pressed tin, and you could buy them by the yard and so on. But still, it all fits together, and you can see agape in that street. Just look at that woman. Who's standing there looking at the house with a bag in her arm. She doesn't mind about the traffic. It's all going to slow down anyway. And so there are real human relations which grow in the shadow of such buildings. It's all about being here. Because I'm running out of time, I'm just going to zoom on to the end with two examples. Here is Florence, which everybody knows, which is 40 square miles and 370,000 people. We in Britain are now facing the question of how to build and how to accommodate our expanding population. Probably half of those 370,000 people are already on the way here. What are we going to do with them? Where are we going to put them? Up to now, the solution that people have had is to build new towns. That way we'll be able to accommodate a growing population. But the only paradigm that we've had is Milton Keynes, which is 88 square miles and has 250,000 people in it. In other words, a quarter of the density. And also, Florence, as you know, has 17 million tourists a year, which produce a huge amount of income. This has 4 a year. So there's an economic problem that comes with this too. So some concluding thoughts. What I've said is that we human beings need to cultivate in ourselves the art of settling. And that means giving vent to this sentiment that I've called oikophilia, this love of home which stretches across generations. We need to confine the human habitat and make it work. And by doing so, we will produce a living landscape also, a landscape around the towns which will work. And I think we do this by respecting boundaries. The street, for instance, is something that should be respected and not intruded upon. It should be built up in the way that Washington Street was, as a place that we share. And likewise in the landscape, boundaries should be respected. Hedgerows, the things that divide fields from each other, and all those ways in which we actually set little segments of our world apart from each other and love them individually rather than trying to run them all together and erode all the edges of things. But meanwhile, we have to deal with the great problem of externalities, which I referred to earlier, and recognise that some problems are not soluble. They're not soluble, at least by the knowledge that we have now. The clean energy problem is not soluble. We haven't got the knowledge to solve it. But we spend our time with these unreal solutions, like the wind farms, which produce a pollution of their own, aesthetic pollution, which destroys our oikophilia, and so makes it less likely that we're going to protect our environment, and not more likely. So in all this, we need to search for a viable first-person plural, which will enable us to act together in protecting the thing that we love. And that, I think, is the most important political message of the environmental movement. And I personally think that that is the main argument for what I call conservatism. To get together with those people with whom you think you belong, and animate a shared sense of identity and a shared sense of belonging. But how to do it in the modern world is the great question. So, thank you.
Hello, hi. So I was interested in the contradictions that came up in a lot of what you were saying. For example, your desire to reduce the use of plastics, but your enjoyment of them in supermarkets. And that led me to wonder about other contradictions. You ask for something that would pull us away from the uglification of cities, but you start off with something as ugly as rational egotism. And the rational egoism that you called on at the beginning as an assumption of humanity. I see rational egoism as that cornerstone that you put as having no boundaries of height, of material usage, when it goes into that lake and tries to take all the fish for itself. That ugliness is so manifest in the way that you talk about other towns and other cities and the people that live in them, including my hometown, Reading.
Hang on, we're allowed to make a comment as well.
Yeah,
so,
I am allowed to make a comment, and one thing that you definitely aren't allowed to do is tell me to shut up.
Hang on.
The question I have is, if you really see this as the path towards conservationism, do you offer an alternative cornerstone to rational egoism?
Subtracting the emotion from what you just said, I would say that my argument has been about how we get free from rational egoism. I want to say that that isn't the only motive we have. I've really been trying to say that there is this other motive, oikophilia, which is our sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to other people in that place, the sense of neighbourhood. And I want to say that we human beings do have within us this natural desire to be with neighbours, and to do for the neighbours what we should, and that we can attach that to our sense of place, and thereby come to share a place. Of course, the Reading problem is a difficult one. I also am from Reading, well, not quite, I'm from Marlow, but it's next door, and have had to live through what to me was the destruction of the town to which I always used to go for the cinema when I was young. I'm a previous generation from you, but of course it is inevitable that towns develop, they grow, but the question is how they should grow. And there is a very good illustration of a town which was taken over by large businesses which built their offices, didn't build them to last, they weren't intending them to last. They made... Sorry? Conservative businesses. Well, this may be so. But if they'd been socialist businesses, would you have liked them? No, probably not.
Hang on.
I really like the sense of building oikophilia, a sense of home as a way of building this intergenerational equity, really, for want of a better word. But your approach is very conservative, and you're trying to conserve a lot of aesthetics, but do you not accept that you need some innovation, and that innovation can actually become part of that sense of home?
I was only... It's true that I was being emphasising aesthetic values at the end, because you can't talk about every aspect. It's the aspect which I think people tend to overlook, because it is the aspect that has been most positive. It has the most positive story behind it when it comes to looking at the history of environmental protection. What has protected the environment in Britain? What has made Britain the place which people still accept as having this kind of sweet landscape where everything seems to be in place and so on? It is that conservationist movement started by Wordsworth and Ruskin, which we've inherited through the 20th century. Same with America, it's the Sierra Club and places, things like that, which has made America still an acceptable place. And so I think one must be very clear that the aesthetic sense is not just a luxury that we have. It is part of our learning how to deal with the world as a shared possession. Empiricists tend to marginalise it as though it's just something, a matter of taste. But it isn't. It is fundamental to our sense of community. But I agree, of course, it's not the only thing, and innovation is important. That's why I gave the example of the railways. The railways actually beautified our landscape. They produce things that people want to preserve. And a very good example is St Pancras Station, which people wanted to pull down, but thanks to John Betjeman, it was kept, and suddenly a new use was found for it as the terminus of the Eurostar, where it has it gives a fantastic sense of entry into London and the greatness of London, and people feel so relaxed in that space. And so there is a very good example of how, if you attend to beauty, you can actually make adaptable things much more easily. But I agree, of course, things have to change, and we have to recognise, we have to cultivate in ourselves the ability to discern the changes that will have a permanent value from those that won't.
I'm also an aesthete. My first training was in the arts, and today I've been at the conference down at the Watershed, which was on nature and well-being. And as we expand in population, many of us are living in cities, and there seemed to be no mention of nature, or as George Monbiot talked about, rewilding and little pockets of nature. And I'm wondering where that is in your vision, because I didn't see any mention of it. No,
you're absolutely right. I didn't mention it because I thought that George would talk about it instead, and he did. But what he never talks about, and what he should, is cities. And because, the damage to nature comes partly because we're not at home in our cities. So we drive out of them at the first opportunity and scatter our rubbish around the fields instead. So if you don't get the cities right, you won't get the nature right either. But of course, I've only touched on three environmental problems. That's energy, plastic, and the city. There is the problem of biodiversity, which is perhaps just as great as that of plastic. It's in fact rather similar because the loss of biodiversity is partly due to that kind of pollution. And yeah, you've got to have a policy about that, but people do again have a natural love for nature. It's a question of releasing it and getting them to understand it. It's an area where education is needed. We all have a natural love of animals, for example, but that natural love of animals, it can be extremely devastating for nature. As we know, cats kill 170 million animals every year in this country. In America, it's something like 12 billion. Regardless of whether they're protected species or not, and that's, our love of cats is a natural thing for us, but it's also devastating for all the species in the immediate environment. So there we do have to educate people and use these natural feelings that we have in a way that will support our environment rather than abuse it.
It seems to me that we have forgotten the difference between our public things in a city and the private ones. So the planning system doesn't distinguish between what's public and what's private. It goes and controls use with devastatingly bad results. But it doesn't protect the streets. It doesn't, as it did in Bath, they did in places like Siena, Rome, Paris, actually design the streets as a public element. And that's what makes those cities so wonderful. And I suggest we need to completely change the planning system so that the public streets and squares and so on are actually controlled directly by our councils. And that people are allowed to use their buildings as they wish.
Well, I think I largely agree with that. There is a gentleman called Nicholas Boys Smith who has founded a charity called Create Streets, which would respond exactly to what you're saying. He says that what makes a town a livable place is the street, and it isn't, and that means the facades and the way things open onto the street. And we shouldn't be so concerned about what goes on behind those facades, although we need a law of nuisance, of course, and all that stuff. And that's why, of course, that's why the Italian cities are so well preserved, because people could do what they want behind those facades, roughly, and so they never feel the need to pull the thing down. But I think this is an issue which, again, it grows out of what I was saying, and it is a matter of educating people to see just how important the street is.
Hello, I've got a question about your energy issues, because you were saying in general that some things can't be touched because it's our inheritance in a sense of it being protected, but at the same time, you're talking about wind turbines as being an irreversible problem. But I would say that surely they're not half as irreversible as nuclear energy, which has got terrible 1,000-year legacy of nuclear waste, which is surely a much harder irreversibility than some metal wind turbines. And the sense of the inheritance, fracking, which is another alternative to wind turbines, is really intruding on people's sense of what belongs to them and their sense of their homes, because it's giving access to underneath people's land and homes and farms. So I just feel there's a sort of contradiction there.
It's not a contradiction. You're just saying that here are some more examples where we shouldn't, where we should be careful not to intrude upon something which is part so deeply in our inheritance that to intrude on it is to, as it were, to interfere with our sense of settlement. I think the problem of nuclear waste is a huge problem. But we have to recognise that the intrusion on people's sense of home from a wind farm above that home is so enormous that you can understand that this solution ought to be the last one that you consider rather than the first one. In particular, of course, given the fact that that these things are, however many of them you have, you'll never get to more than 20% of your energy needs. So I think one just needs to think all these things through in a different way, asking yourself the question, what is it that people want from the place where they are? What is it that makes them love that place? And how can we fit our energy policy into the maintenance of that sentiment, rather than simply wiping it out? If you wipe that sentiment away, what's the point? You've just wiped away with it the only motive that people have for protecting their environment in the first place.
Yeah.
I feel I have a wonderful love for whatever place I'm in, but while I meet my material needs, I'm leaching resources from places far, far away from me all the time, and we all are. If it's not a wind turbine over my head, then it's fossil fuels from Canadian tar sands or underneath deserts in the Middle East, exacerbating population growths that are going to collapse in those places. I personally see a wind turbine as the least problematic of the ways we could meet our energy needs. But meeting our needs is the crux of my question, because you mentioned in your talk that there are 7 billion people on the Earth who are to have the lifestyle they expect. I think that was your word, expect. And it seems to me that meeting demand has got the question backward. I think our great-grandchildren will look at us sitting in this room and think, do we need 48 lights on? Probably not, especially if we're burning coal and gas to light ourselves. So I agree we need to look at the problem differently, but I think differently from yourself. So should we be addressing that demand, or should people simply get what they want if they don't have to look at where it comes from?
Well, of course, you're right that it is probable that we can't meet all the demands. We certainly wouldn't be able to meet all the demands that people would make if they could. But then this raises the question of how are you going to control them making those demands? Are you going to forbid them from making them? What kind of political structure would one recommend that actually filters out the acceptable from the unacceptable demands? And I think this is a problem that we all have, and there isn't a simple solution to it. We have to recognise that we must make sacrifices, but that's why I referred to Edmund Burke, because he pointed out that there is one thing that makes people make sacrifices, and that's their sense of inheritance, the sense that they owe something to their people who are coming after them, and that they themselves owe something to the people who had come before them. That out of that sentiment, one can build a motive for restraint, and that is familiar to all of us. And to emphasize that seems to me to be the most important thing, rather than emphasizing just the fact that we exist here and now for our own satisfactions alone. And so, the question then is how you build that into a policy. Nobody, to my mind, has come up with anything like a policy for controlling the appetites of 7 billion people in such a way that the Earth will benefit from that control. And the attempts to control people through totalitarian systems have been, from the point of view of the environment, much, much worse than the controls the small controls that we ourselves have experienced under the regime of a free economy. As everybody knows, that the whole areas of what is now Russia, were devastated by the fact that people wanted to control what was going on completely, and they made mistakes, and those mistakes proved to be irreversible. And I think we don't have the knowledge that enables us to control things in that way.
Hi, as a scientist, I'm interested in the first part of your talk. The chief executive of General Electric, which is one of the world leading providers of nuclear equipment, referred to nuclear energy as technologically difficult and too expensive to scale up. He referred to the world today as the world of gas and wind, whereas you seem to suggest it's the world of gas and nuclear. So could you comment on how you exactly disagree with the Chief Executive of General Electric? Thanks.
It's an interesting question. I've never been asked to have an opinion about the Chief Executive of General Electric before. My view of the matter is that to solve if solution to the energy problem means finding a source of energy sufficient to satisfy current demand without any adverse environmental side effects, my view is that we haven't got that. And we might get it if we could master nuclear fusion or something like that, or if we could find a way of trapping solar power which was sufficiently concentrated that we didn't have to spread the devices over everything and obscure the planet with them, then we would then have a solution. But my view is that we haven't yet got a solution, but we nevertheless rush towards these unreal solutions like wind, which have side effects which are environmentally much more damaging because they damage the only really positive thing that we have, which is our own sense of oikophilia. I think we must remember that human beings are our most important asset, and if you misuse them, then you're misusing the only thing that you really ultimately have.
Yeah, so I'm also wondering about the wind turbines. So I feel a bit like you're saying it's more important what the environment looks like than actually if we have power. And also, I think part of the problem that you're missing with wind turbines is that we're using those rather than fossil fuels because of global warming. Well, if we're not using wind turbines, the only other option is fossil fuels, and then in which case we won't have an environment to appreciate. Our coasts will all be eroded, and I don't feel that you can say we need to put all of our money into finding this mythical and magical energy power that we might find, because it might take 50 or so years, which we don't actually have. So I'm not entirely sure what my question is, but I was pretty annoyed by that.
Well, if it were the case that wind turbines in a reasonable quantity of them could actually provide all our energy needs, then there would be a real question as to whether we should go down this path. But even in Denmark, where the landscape is essentially obliterated all along the coast by wind turbines, they only provide 20% of the energy needs of the country. So you're still going to have that problem of all these other things. And the real problem is how to get free from fossil fuels. I think we all agree with that. Those are the things that, as we currently understand it at least, produce the greenhouse gases which threaten us with climate change. It's a controversial question, I know, how much they do and all that, but if that is the problem, this is not the solution. We've got to find something which really can replace fossil fuels in the sense of producing the same amount of energy, and we haven't found that yet.
Towards the beginning of your talk, you spoke of the we as a necessary input into practical reasoning. What kind of necessity is that? It doesn't seem, for example, to be a logical necessity.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. It's necessary to think in these terms if you are to reason about the problems that you have, because some of those problems that you have as a member of a community and not as a first-person chooser. This goes back to the first question that a lady raised about the rational egoist. If you thought that rationality was simply a matter of the first-person case, of being ascertaining what it is rational for you to do given that your desires and your beliefs, then maybe there's no place for this we. But I think that that's a false conception of practical reasoning, and that there is reasoning which begins from a first-person plural. And if we don't engage in that kind of reasoning, we are actually isolating ourselves from the problems that we have. Because most of the problems that we really have, we have as members of communities and not as individuals.
So essentially, I agree with what you're saying, that the new developments shouldn't just be a means to an end, there should be an aesthetic element to them. But I think you're letting your personal sense of aesthetics sort of get in the way of progress. I don't know, it's quite an egotistical thing to say that your personal aesthetic trumps everyone else's. I personally know quite a lot of people that find wind turbines beautiful as well as useful. Also on a technical note, at the moment, the main issue with wind turbines is the fact that you can't store the electricity that's produced from them, not that they don't produce enough. So I guess the question is, would you be willing to accept the wind turbines as sort of a design iteration on the road to an entirely renewable energy future if you found them a little bit more aesthetically pleasing?
I understand what you're saying about people who find wind turbines beautiful. I've come across this view expressed by quite a lot of people, but not one of them lives underneath one. It's usually expressed in terms also of contempt towards the NIMBYs who protest against them. Now, if I did find them beautiful, maybe I would be less disposed to be antagonistic. But the real problem, I think, is the vast amount of space that they eat up for a very small result. And they produce a permanent change in the aspect of a place. And permanent changes in the aspect of a place are precisely what normal human beings resist. So you have to accept that human beings are going to resist these things. So either you override people's natural sentiments, which is a threat to them, or you have to recognize that you just can't do it. And I think, it's like so many solutions that come down from above. At some point, you've got to make the decision, am I going to dictate this to people, or am I going to let their feelings prevail? And I think that has not been sufficiently discussed, that question.
Thank you, Roger, very much indeed. A few of us are from Coleridge in Wales. We're delighted to be here, and congratulations to Andrew for this. Oikophilia seems to be, has always been part of the polis, which is part of the oikumene. So it's always been contested and conflictual. So when we get to aesthetics, do you have in your mind a continuing universal basis for those judgments? For example, some people would see your instrumentalism as the opposite of aesthetics, and yet others would say instrumentalism as human utility in the production of goods and services can be compatible with aesthetics. You know, Morris, Ruskin, Bauhaus, the Bauhaus people talk endlessly about the creativity between those two things. If they can be compatible for the future, where do we draw upon in the future? The word innovation does come to mind. Where do you look to for the basis for those negotiations and judgments? And is it agape? And how would that be universalized across the diversity we're facing globally?
Well, that's a very deep philosophical question. And what I would say in response to it is this, that you can acknowledge that aesthetic judgments are rational and form part of a reasoned dialogue, even if you don't think that they are ultimately provable. Kant said that in making aesthetic judgments, we are suitors for agreement, which is a rather beautiful way of putting it. In other words, we put these judgments forward in order to come to some reconciliation with our neighbours. And if people think in these terms, the negotiation begins. And when it comes to politics, it's not a question of imposing your aesthetic judgment from above on the mass of mankind. It's a question rather of respecting the consensus, if there is one, that emerges from their own negotiations with each other. That consensus you can see all over Italy in those beautiful cities that they inherited. And you can see it in many of our towns too. And sometimes the consensus is broken. But when it is broken, it's usually either because some extremely wealthy firm has implanted itself in the middle of things with a non-negotiable purpose of its own, or it's because some ghastly planning mistake has been made, again by a bureaucrat who doesn't have to pay the cost of it. But if you leave people alone, on the whole, you get things like that street that I showed you in Washington. There may be, of course, that the tastes change, and there may be no final answer to the question of what is right and wrong, but from the point of view of politics, that doesn't matter. What does matter is whether you are respecting the consensus that arises naturally from people living side by side.
Join with me in thanking Professor Roger Scruton. Thank you.